Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with this. Let me make sure I can zoom through. Okay. And this, again, this will go just between me and you, or me and the design team. This will be for the counterterrorism section post 9/11. So uh, I'll go ahead and get started now. So, uh, welcome to the counterterrorism section. Again, this is the post 9/11 uh, Islamic extremism counterterrorism section. And what I'm going to do is just provide this brief I gave to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center on the Islamic threat, the potential against really the domestic U.S. Focus area. So just a couple of things. I'll talk initial observations, domestic jihadist threat, ISIS in the U.S., and then the intelligence failures that we've had in the post 9/11 era. So just initial observations. If there are three things to take away from this, I'll just say this. One, are indicators and warnings disseminated to the lowest level? And what I mean by this chart is we collect things at the federal level through our immigration, through our intelligence services, et cetera. But is that being shared downward? Is that being shared to the police officer on the beat who actually has interactions with these communities? I argue that that information flow isn't as idealistic as it should be. Second, when does radicalization deserve further scrutiny? When do we put people on watch lists? When do we arrest them? Now, there are procedures for doing this, but again, it's subject to interpretation, individual to individual, group by group, state versus federal, et cetera. All of these people that you hear, so the Fort Hood shooting in 2009, the Christmas Day bombing in 2009, the Boston Marathon attack in 2013, all of them had indicators prior to their attack, prior to when they conducted. They all had some sort of worrisome trend. So the question is, when do we put them on a watch list, and what can be done if they are showing signs of radicalization but aren't doing enough to be arrested or detained? Again, we live in a free society. You can't lock people up based on their speech. You can't lock people up based on feelings. You have to have concrete law-breaking evidence to show that they are about to commit a crime. And that's one of the big difficulties going forward. And you'll see that in some of the case studies we talk about. And then finally, is law enforcement approachable? Let me ask it in a different way. If I had a daughter or a son that was going on some of these jihadist websites, ISIS websites, etc., would I be comfortable enough to go to my local law enforcement and say, there's something, my son is going down this wrong path? Do I have that level of approachability? I'll also say is there a law enforcement organization out there that uses open source intelligence, searching on these websites, identifying potential radicalized individuals, and instead of trying to build a case to arrest or detain them, are they trying to do something called uh, diversion programs? They have them a lot for gangs where they're trying to get kids out of the cycles of gang violence and into more productive activities. Well, is there a law enforcement or federal agency that does that to try and bring people to have that same concept, that diversion program, so they can be led off the path that they're going on? If anyone finds me that type of group or that agency that's doing that effectively, let me know and I'll buy you a beer, because I have not seen that implemented successfully. So domestic jihadist threat, again, what we saw from 2009 to really 2021, 22, and actually spiked down and then spiking back up, are, again, American citizens engaged with Islamic extremism in one form or another. There's multiple incidents particularly between 2009 and 2019, between the Fort Hood, Boston Marathon, the San Bernardino shooting, Times Square. There have been others in New York and Chattanooga as well. So we've had multiple incidents. We've also had in the middle terrorist travel, people getting on planes and traveling to Syria or Somalia or other jihadist hotspots, and pledging fealty to these organizations. And then finally, you have an online presence. You have a large amount of U.S. citizens, or a good portion of U.S. citizens, engaged in one form or another, either actively on these websites, chatting and talking to people, or passively viewing these websites. And we've seen that spike really since 2014, but it's a significant issue. So there is a threat, and it is impacting U.S. citizens going forward. And why? Why have we seen this? Well, a couple of things, and this is really since 2009. We've had an economic downturn since in 2009. When there is a downturn, people tend to go to the extremes. Although economics really doesn't play a massive role in it, it plays some role. The internet has become much more interactive. It started with Facebook and Twitter, then YouTube came online. Now it's TikTok. But there are all sorts of different radicalization mechanisms that may not have been there with a static website back in the early 2000s. You had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, ongoing until 2021 in Afghanistan, ongoing in Iraq since 2003, that have been a contributing factor. Now you've had the Somali-Ethiopian civil war, which has been a attractor for people to come because of their tribal or familiar allegiance to come to Somalia, not necessarily to participate in a jihad or a global jihad, but to maybe defend their own territory, cult or clan, family unit in those conflicts. And then finally, you have the ISIS brand. And ISIS, again, it's one of those things that comes up and down, up and down, up and down. I don't think it's going to go away completely. In 2014, their brand was victory. They were able to take large swaths of Iraq and territory, and that was attractive to people all throughout the region. That was defeated in 2017. They were on the lam in 2017, but then starting, in 2021, 2022, the October 6th attack and the subsequent violence related to that have given ISIS kind of a new lease on life, and we're starting to see an upsurge in ISIS activity since then. So these are all contributing factors on why U.S. citizens are engaged in this type of activity. So I bring this up. The Paris attack in 2015 was a significant watershed because that was ISIS really went into Europe, and many of you, and if you watch the documentary ISIS in Europe, you'll see ISIS activity occurring again in France, Belgium, England, etc. And the question is, can it happen in the U.S.? Well, yes, it can happen in the U.S., but Europe is much more of a haven for this for several reasons. Europe is, the Islamic population is poorly integrated, as opposed to the Islamic population in the United States, which is on a higher socioeconomic plane than even our native populations. So the Muslim population, again, largely because of the post-colonial legacies in North Africa, particularly in France, are not as well integrated into society. Then finally, you kind of have, open borders. Really, in Europe, it's the Schengen zone, and what you will hear the term "get to Greece." That means Greece, which has a poor border security, hard to secure because it's hundreds of islands. You get to Greece, then you have access to the rest of the continent. Obviously, in the United States, you don't have that type of porous border, at least on the exterior of the country. And then in the United States, you have a pretty significant law enforcement capability that you saw in the documentary. Europe wanted to keep a hands-off approach, largely because of the legacies of the Nazi regime. So they didn't want to be intrusive. And the perfect example is the PNR data, the passenger record data that the United States was asking for from Europe for years, and only got it after years of asking. The Europeans didn't want to part with that because they didn't want to have the privacy violations. So again, different mentality in Europe. I don't think, and again, I'm might be speaking out of turn, but the complex attacks, whether you saw 9/11 or the Paris attack, can happen in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have lone wolves, one-off radicalized individuals, etc. But the complex Islamic threat, I should say, is unlikely to happen in the same regard in the United States. So ISIS activity in the U.S. Again, these are just some numbers in January 2015. Just kind of shows the numbers of people that were tracked in 2015 coming in the Islamic State. It shouldn't be surprising, again, in many of the Muslim countries in North Africa. But when you get to Europe, just to look at some of the numbers are significant, particularly when you're talking about the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Belgium. These countries don't have a huge Islamic population. So the fact that a large portion of them are willing to travel to ISIS territories is significant. Now, again, this is 2015. These numbers have gone down, or the rate aren't as high, but you can imagine another ISIS threat coming and having this level of attractiveness to certain populations. And again, I'm not here to argue that these populations aren't downtrodden and they've been discriminated against in their native populations, but there is attractiveness to certain causes amongst the citizens of these populations. The other thing to consider is the low numbers in what they call the pig countries: Portugal, Ireland, Italy, etc., Greece. And these are actually a lower proportion than kind of the Scandinavian countries. And that's an interesting phenomenon. And one argument that's been bandied around is that if you're too poor, and again, if you're Muslim in Spain or Italy, you're probably on the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic stratosphere. If you're too poor, you can't engage in jihadi activity. That's one of the theories that have been floated out there, and it has some merit. You're probably wealthier in Denmark, probably you're wealthier in England. You can participate in a worldwide jihadist threat, for lack of a better term. If you're in Italy or Spain, you have trouble putting food on the table, you're less likely to engage in this activity. So that's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Just again, overall, as of late 2016, 250 Americans had traveled to ISIS-controlled areas. 71 had been charged. And here are just some numbers, with 56 being arrested just in 2015. So there was a huge spike in activity in 2015, 2016 timeframe. And this is, again, in the U.S., the age range and where they're coming from. And this shouldn't be surprising, given there's large diasporas in New York, in Minnesota, in California. So again, it reflects the diasporas that are in our country, and the age range shouldn't be too much of an issue, or shouldn't be too surprising. Again, people tend to age out of terrorism. Terrorism is a young man's game, a young single man's game, and as people get older, they tend to not engage in this activity. And that's true for terrorism, it's true for crime, true for those activities. Average age, most are male. Again, the females make a lot of the news because that's very unique, but the vast majority are male. And again, just some of the ISIS social media trigger points. Again, their message in 2014 was move towards a caliphate or a religious duty to actually come to ISIS-controlled territories. And again, they use social media to trigger radicalization process, recruit individuals to join ISIS, and incite others to carry out attacks in the US. And that was their messaging from 2015 on. And the bottom point, again, what has credibility when you're doing a terrorist social media campaign is having Americans who speak fluent English and are, understand idiomatic English, speaking on these social media platforms and telling what a great life it is, what a great experience it is. And this is really, we have social media influencers for all sorts of products in our world. This is kind of an example of it. Is an American with perfect English is going to be able to resonate with a domestic audience going forward. So there's one, again, this is not her, this is her Twitter handler. It kind of shows how the radicalization process occurred. So you might not remember who James Foley was. He was beheaded by ISIS on social media. You might look at that and think that is brutal and that is a barbaric act, and it certainly was. But it was also a way to get widespread, for lack of a better term, it to go viral. If you just did something not as violent, it wouldn't have gotten the attention that it did. So, the curiosity over James Foley brought, the millions of hits, brought her onto it. When she interacted with those followers, she got many more Twitter followers. And it's kind of, the generation like, right? People do all sorts of things in their teens on Instagram and other social media platforms to get likes. And that's what happened. And that's how she went down this radicalization path. The more she engaged on ISIS websites, the more likes she got, the more Twitter followers she got, which in turn forced her to interact more on these websites, which turned her towards radicalization. For those of you who've ever studied digital marketing, it's a classic sales funnel, right? You do something to get 1 million views on your website, and of those 1 million views, you can capture people with good copy and good writing, and of those, then maybe 100,000 will actually click on the websites, and then of those 100,000, 10,000 might read the website, and then of those 10,000, like 2,000 will buy the product. And that's kind of how ISIS radicalization occurs. You get millions of followers. Of those millions, thousands might actually interact on the website. Of those thousands, hundreds might actually want to travel to ISIS-controlled territories. Again, social media, WhatsApp, Kik is big outside the United States, and WhatsApp as well, all used to facilitate movement to Syria. So I want to talk about intelligence failures for a second. There's several case studies I want to bring up in this brief. So Fort Hood is the first one. And go ahead, pause me and watch the video that I have linked in this section. Okay, so that kind of gave you a good overview of the Fort Hood case study, in addition to the reading that you were tasked to read. So, what is Fort Hood? So, it's intelligence poorly coordinated, and what you have on the left is Nidal Hassan's history. So you had him openly questioning whether you can engage in combat against other Muslims. You had him talking about his loyalty to the Islam over the Constitution. The chain of command was aware of this, his military chain of command. So you had that on one side. On the other side, you had Hassan's communications with Anwar al-Awlaki. He first communicated in December 2008. This was intercepted by the San Diego JTTF. The Defense Criminal Investigative Services never informed the chain of command. So the JTTF and Defense Criminal Investigative Services was aware of his communications with Anwar al-Awlaki, a known terrorist. His chain of command was aware of his troubling behavior, but those two aspects were not put together, and that's the intelligence failure. So some outstanding questions. When does radicalization deserve further scrutiny? At what point, based on the video you saw and the reading, should he have been questioned further, arrested, detained? Even if you were able to put those two aspects together, his communications as well as his behavior, at what point could you have done something about it? At what point would you have been separated from the military? And this has been going on for not just Islamic extremists, but right-wing extremists as well. When have they gone, whether it's on their social media, whether it's in what they've said to fellow soldiers, when have they gone to a point where they deserve to be separated from the military? If there was a proper reporting structure between the two, what could it have been done? Could you have detained him? Could you have arrested him? And finally, would it have made a difference? Let's just say we put all that pieces together. Was there enough to arrest him? Maybe. Probably not. Could you have separated him? Maybe. Probably. But even then, what's to stop him from purchasing a gun and going to instead of on Fort Hood, going to any facility outside of Fort Hood that has 20 soldiers and opening fire? What could have been done in this case? I'm not quite sure that we could have done something that would have stopped, him purchasing a gun and being able to shoot up a facility. But I'll let you decide. So the next case study is the Christmas Day bomber. And again, a couple of things. There's intelligence failures here that are outlined in the BBC video, and then problems with watch listing. So again, the intelligence failures, we did know he was being radicalized. His father had mentioned it. We did know that he had interactions with Anwar al-Awlaki, yet he was still able to board the flight. Now, we did know that he was a threat when the flight was, over the Atlantic, but we did not know that he was, we didn't push that information far enough. So that was a key point. The other key point was, I call it risk-based security. What I mention is that we need to classify people coming through the gate. I don't mean profiling, that's, based on race, but we know, and we knew in this case, that he had traveled to Yemen. We knew that he was traveling alone. We knew that he paid in cash. So he engaged in kind of suspicious activity. And based on that, we could have classified him. We could know that he's, he chose to sit over the wing, which is an indicator. Given these indicators, my recommendation is that we classify him. And you saw in the documentary that they were trying to do behavioral detection on everyone. Well, it doesn't work if you do it on everyone. If you do it on 400 people, you get 15 seconds per person. That's not enough. You have to focus your assets on who are the highest risk groups, whether that's screeners. And I challenge you next time you fly the airplane to look at the screeners. They're not going to know when they treat 400 bags the same way. They're not going to know what is, they can't pick out anything that easily. So I challenge you to think, okay, who are the high risk people that have traveled, who pay in cash, who have a history of traveling to maybe some, Yemen or other areas, who choose to sit on the wing, who travel on the 16th, but buy their ticket on the 15th. Those are all known activities by the airlines. That information is known. So I would ask that they put in a higher risk category and get further scrutiny. I'll also just say it is difficult to take down an airplane. I have a diagram at the bottom there, and it shows that if the bag is randomly put in here in the baggage compartment, due to explosive shock propagation, if it explodes and it's in there and it's covered by a bunch of bags, actually is probably not going to take down the airplane. You need to do what Nadal Hassan is and get into the compartment, the passenger compartment, to be effective. So you can classify people based on their risk. Is their baggage high risk? And then you can put it in a way, impact the plane in a way that prevents it from being in the more high risk area. You can get the crew involved. You can say, hey, our high risk passengers are in these seats, these seats, these seats. Flight attendant, I just want to make you aware. So if he's acting suspicious, as the underwear bomber was, then you can add more scrutiny. So I want to just, again, that's risk-based security. It's not based on racial profiling, which I hardly disagree with, or we don't want a racial profile. We don't want random TSA agent to start looking down, say, oh, that guy looks a little suspicious. We want to use data to inform risk-based solutions to focus our assets. That is a much better way than what we saw in 2009 and really what we're seeing now. So finally, the Boston Marathon bombing. What I just want to say is what the intelligence failure was 4 issues. One, we knew the Tsarnaev brothers were, or at least the older Tsarnaev brother, were being tipped off by the Russians. That the Russians had informed us, and this is when relations were better than they are now, of that the older Tsarnaev brother was suspicious. That's number one. Number two, he was traveling to Dagestan, a known hotspot. We knew that. Number three, when he came back, we incorrectly put his information in a system called TEX, which is the immigration system. So when we flag people, we put we put a record of their data in the database. Unfortunately, we put his information incorrectly, so we couldn't retrieve his data on the database. And then finally, particularly the older brother, he had all sorts of jihadist information on his social media accounts. So you had these pieces of information out there, but they weren't put together in a profile that could have done something. But even if they were, and again, later it was found out that the older brother had actually murdered one of his ex-girlfriends. But even, if we take that aside, if you'd put that information together, would there have been enough to arrest or detain them? Could you have stopped the Boston bombing? I don't have an answer on that. And I'll leave it up to you whether you think this would have crossed the threshold where we could have arrested, further interrogation, etc. And would it have actually prevented the 2013 Boston attack? Again, I'll let you decide. So again, just overall thoughts are just to end that are indicators and warnings disseminated at the lowest level. When does radicalization deserve further scrutiny, watch listing, or arrest? And is law enforcement approachable? I just want to leave you with these 3 thoughts going forward and ask that you bring these back to your organizations, particularly if they're involved in domestic law enforcement. And that concludes it. And I'll go ahead and stop the recording now.